Om Sarashivasamarambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmaracharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Om. Good. Be seated, please. Parameshvara. Good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karava Vahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Good. Welcome to all of you, and welcome also to our many students watching this class online. It's a happy day. We begin chapter 18 of the Bhagavad Gita, final chapter, as you know. We'll begin with recitation, and as always, as I'm reciting, read the translation, and then repeat after me. Ajno vacha, sannyasasya mahabaho, sannyasasya mahabaho, tattvamiccami veditum, tyagasya chahrishikesha, Pratakesha Nishudana, Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Shri Bhagavan, Kamyanam Karmanam Nyasam, Sannyasam Kavayo Viduhu, Sarva Karma Palatyagam, Prahustyagam Vichakshanaha, Tyajyam doshavadityeke, Karma prahurmanish, Yajnadanatapa karma, Natyajamati chapare, Nishchayam shunume tatra, Nishchayam shunume, Tyage bharata sattama, Tyage hi purusha vyagra, Tyago hi purusha vyagro, hi purusha vyagra, Triveda samprakirtitaha, Yajnadanatapa karma, Natyajam karyameva tata, Yajnodanam tapashchaiva, Pavanani manishinam, Etan yapitu karmani, Sangam tyaktva palani cha, kartavyani me partha, kartavyani nishchitam matamuttamam, nishchitam matamuttamam. Very nice. So, Chapter 18 is entitled Moksha Sannyasa Yoga, moksha liberation, sannyasa renunciation. Turns out the first topic of the chapter is sannyasa, and the last topic of the chapter is moksha, liberation. It's the longest chapter in the Bhagavad Gita, and more or less it's in two halves. The first half is a continuation of what we've been studying, starting back in chapter 14, Sattva, Rajas, Tamas. And that kind of analysis continued in chapters 16 and 17. 15 is a little bit out of context there. So Sattva, Rajas, Tamas began in chapter 14, continues in 16 and 17, also continues here at the beginning, the first half of chapter 18. By the way, that concentration on Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, this analysis, very analytical, which is why the final 6 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita are said to be devoted in part to jnanam, knowledge. Remember our threefold analysis of the entire Bhagavad Gita? 3 groups of 6 chapters? There are several ways of making that division. One of those ways is to say the first 6 chapters have as a primary topic, not only topic, but a primary topic is karma, karma yoga. The middle 6 chapters, chapters 7 through 12, have as a primary topic bhakti. So first 6, karma, middle 6, bhakti, and the final 6, jnanam. And because of that emphasis on this analysis in terms of sattva, rajas, and tamas, which is what we're going to see, not immediately, but it comes after several verses. It begins with Arjuna's question about sannyasa. And Arjuna has been kind of asking about this from almost the beginning of the text. Some of you might remember that in the very opening part of chapter 2, Arjuna says that instead of killing all of these great ones, it would be better for me to live a life of alms. Who lives a life of alms? A sannyasi. So Arjuna is kind of playing with the idea of leaving the battlefield and taking to a life of a Hindu monk. Of course, Sri Krishna discourages him from doing that. But Arjuna doesn't get convinced immediately, because the beginning of chapter 3, he asks about renunciation. Chapter 5 is dedicated to renunciation. The entire chapter, sannyasa, is the title of the chapter. So quite a bit of discussion previously in the Bhagavad Gita has been focused on sannyasa, on renunciation, and it comes back one last time here at the beginning of chapter 18, where Arjuna asks, Arjuna uvacha, sannyasasya mahabaho, sannyasasya mahabaho, tattvamiccami veditum, tyagasya cha hrishikesha, Tyagasya cha hrishikesha pratakesha nishudana. Starting the second line, Arjuna asks, Ichhami, I want, veditum, to know. I want to know the tattvam, the truth. I want to know the truth of what? And it's a twofold question. So he wants to know the truth of, first line, sannyasasya. I want to know the truth of sannyasa, renunciation. And I want to know the truth of tyagasya, tyaga, in the third line. And I pause because sannyasa means renunciation, tyaga means renunciation. What? There are shades of meaning. And here, Sri Krishna is going to very clearly separate these two, but both of the words have more or less the same meaning, renunciation. Sri Krishna is going to differentiate the two in context, and we're going to see in just a moment what is Sri Krishna's. In every word, it has to be understood in context, right? Sometimes we forget how important context is. If I give you the word B-O-W, what does it mean? Depends on context, right? It could mean to bow. It could mean a bow. It could mean the front of a boat as a bow. It could mean the decoration on top of a present. It could mean the sound your dog makes. My point is that the meaning of every word in English, in Sanskrit, and Hindi, in any language, meaning has to be determined from context. We'll see what the meaning of sannyasa and tyaga mean in this context. Arjuna wants to know about them both. Last line, pratak, separately. He wants to know separately what is sannyasa, what is tyaga. He wants to know. Notice there are 3 terms of address to Sri Krishna here. First he says, Mahabaho, O mighty armed ones. Then he says, Hrishikesha, Hrishika, Isha, we gave that etymology long ago, Lord of the senses. And then he says, Keshi, Nishudana. This is a reference to the Bhagavatam story about the young Krishna killing the demon Keshi. So 3 terms of address. By the way, some people like to look for deeper meanings. So what is the deeper meaning because of which Arjuna used 3 terms of address in the first verse of this chapter? Well, please remember that this is not a transcript of the dialogue that took place in the chariot. Sri Krishna and Arjuna, first of all, they weren't speaking in Sanskrit, and they certainly weren't speaking in Sanskrit verses, right? So there was a dialogue in that chariot. That dialogue was known by Vyasa because he had that power to know pretty much anything and everything. Based on Vyasa's understanding of that dialogue, Vyasa composed these verses. And if you ask, why did Vyasa include these 3 terms of address? Not a deeper meaning. It was convenient. Honestly, you have to fill up the meter of each line. Each line has to have 8 syllables. He's just filling up the meter. Then, Sri Krishna replies, Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Kamyanam Karmanam Nyasam, Kamyanam Karmanam Nyasam, Sannyasam Kavayo Viduhu, Sannyasam Kavayo Viduhu, Sarva Karma Palatyagam, Sarva Karma Palatyagam, Prahustyagam Vichakshanaha, Prahustyagam Vichakshanaha. Start in the second line. Kavayaha Viduhu. Kavi here is in plural. Kavi often means poet. Here it means the enlightened ones. Kavayaha, the enlightened ones, the wise. Viduhu, they know, they understood. What did they understand? They understood that sannyasam, that the word sannyasa means what? First line, sannyasam means the nyasam. By the way, the etymology, sam here as a prefix means completely. It has other meanings as well, completely or well. The root nyas means literally to throw down. Sometimes it's broken down as ni plus us. Us is to throw, ni, down. To throw something down is the root from which the word nyasa is derived. So nyasam means renunciation, throwing down, literally. It means the renunciation of what? Karmanam, the renunciation of actions. What kind of actions? Kamyanam. Kamya, karma, are karmas to fulfill desires. Kamya, from kama, desire. Kamya karma is to act to fulfill desires, which is conventional action. That's what everyone does. Everyone acts to fulfill desires. Why did you come to class today? To fulfill desires. Of course, we're going to see karma yoga in just a moment. Suppose someone wants to renounce conventional worldly life and live a lifestyle that is dedicated exclusively to spiritual growth. That is, we'll call it lifestyle sannyasa. And that's what Sri Krishna is referring to in the first half of the verse. He is defining sannyasa as a particular lifestyle, a lifestyle that you take. First of all, there's a process of, there's diksha, there's a process of initiation. You are initiated by your guru through certain rituals, in fact, very elaborate rituals. And through those rituals, you renounce all worldly desires. Does that mean you're desireless? Certainly not. Why did you renounce worldly desires? Because you desire something spiritual. So there's still that desire. A desire for spiritual growth, a desire for moksha, liberation. So this is why one takes to the lifestyle of sannyasa, the lifestyle of a Hindu monk, the giving up all worldly desires, kamya karma, for the sake of focusing exclusively on spiritual growth. That is Sri Krishna's definition of sannyasa. Again, it's a contextual meaning. You'll find back in chapter 5, he uses sannyasa in 3 or 4 different ways, in addition to this way. So we won't go back there. Now he talks about tyaga. So tyagasya, where am I? There I am. Sarva last line. Vichakshanaha, the wise ones, the skillful ones. The wise ones, prahuhu, the wise ones call tyagam. That, remember Arjuna's twofold question, what is sannyasa? What is tyaga? Sannyasa is the lifestyle of a Hindu monk. How does Sri Krishna interpret tyaga, which has almost the same meaning as sannyasa? He says, tyaga is sarva karma phala tyagam. Notice that sannyasa was karma tyaga, the renunciation of karma. Here it is phala tyaga, renunciation of phala. Fine, what does that mean? Karma phala is the result of your deeds. And if you remember, way back in chapter 2, we began our discussion of karma yoga. And you might be surprised that Sri Krishna's definition of tyaga here is karma yoga. And if you wonder, wait a minute, how can karma yoga be tyaga? If you ask that question, you missed our classes on chapters 2 and 3 and 5, where we discussed all that quite a bit, but let me explain it now. When you act driven to get the results of your action, that's kamya karma, which was renounced by the sannyasis in the first half of this verse, that's conventional worldly thinking. A karma yogi is far away from that conventional attitude towards worldly activities. How? The karma yogi is one who has, by the way, this is actually a very deep and important subject matter, which is why so much of the early chapters of the Bhagavad Gita are devoted to this topic. Karma yoga is a very deep and rich topic. We'll see it in brief right now. The karma yogi is absolutely a world apart. Worlds apart, I guess is the expression. The karma yogi is worlds apart from one who thinks conventionally, I want this, I want to avoid that. I want this, raga. I want to avoid that, dvesha. Those compulsions to chase after what is desirable, to run away from what is undesirable, raga and dvesha are the compulsions that mold and drive conventional human behavior, but not for the karma yogi. The karma yogi is one who says, karma yogi is one who has discovered that by chasing after things I desire and by running away from things that are undesirable, the karma yogi realizes I will never find contentment and peace by doing that. The karma yogi realizes the futility of conventional worldly life. And the karma yogi is one who is determined to break free, excuse me, sorry. The karma yogi is one who is determined to break free of the compulsivity of raga and dvesha. How does the karma yogi do that? By understanding that futility. When you really get it, that by chasing after what you want and by avoiding what you don't want, it's not going to make you happy, it's not going to bring contentment, it's not going to lead to true inner peace. A karma yogi gets it, and that changes his or her behavior. They start to break away from being confined by that compulsivity. They start to break out of that compulsive behavior, and instead of acting on their raga, dvesha, they act according to dharma. Step one. This is where it begins. This is where spiritual life begins. This is where karma yoga begins, with the recognition, and this point can't be underestimated. Karma yoga begins with the understanding that conventional worldly activities will never, ever lead to perfect contentment and peace. Therefore, the karma yogi understands the futility of conventional worldly life, the futility of being continually driven by raga, dvesha. Now, having recognized that, what is the karma yogi's attitude towards dharma? Dharma includes his or her responsibilities. The karma yogi has recognized the futility of conventional life. Does it mean that karma yogi doesn't go to work on Monday morning? Well, if the karma yogi doesn't go to work on Monday morning, things are going to get a lot worse very rapidly. The karma yogi wants peace and contentment. Not going to work is not helpful, right? So the karma yogi, as a minimum, has to fulfill his or her duties. But here's where that shift in orientation comes in. Previously, which means before the karma yogi was a yogi. In fact, the word they use is, before you become a yogi, you are a bhogi. Bhogi is one who wants enjoyment. So when this person was a bhogi, seeking enjoyment, this person went to work on Monday morning. Why? To get more money, to get more bhoga, more enjoyment. That was the orientation before this understanding arose, and the bhogi became a yogi. So when this bhogi becomes a yogi, he or she still goes to work, but with a completely transformed attitude. Instead of going to work to get more money for more enjoyment, the karma yogi goes to work because it's dharma. It's my responsibility, it's my duty, which means not for the sake of bhoga. Previously, it was for the sake of bhoga. Now, it goes to work not for the sake of bhoga. That enjoyment is the phala, the result of going to work. And that brings us back to the verse. Sarva karma phala tyagam. The karma yogi is one who has done the tyaga, the renunciation, not of karma, still goes to work, but the renunciation of karma phala, the results of that work. And the results of that work are bhoga, sarva karma phala, all karma phala, all worldly enjoyments. Notice in the first half, the sannyasi gives up all worldly enjoyments, full stop. In the second one, the tyagi, we'll call this person, the sannyasi gives up all worldly enjoyments and becomes a lifestyle sannyasa. Here, the tyagi is also a renunciate, but doesn't renounce all worldly enjoyments. Instead, he or she renounces being driven by the results of all worldly activities, no longer focused on the results. This is a massive transformation of one's thinking. It's like in religion, they talk about conversion. You can be converted from one religion to another, and sometimes there are such things as conversion experiences. Here, the conversion is from bhogi to yogi, from being driven to get worldly enjoyment. The conversion is to be driven to gain spiritual growth, recognizing the futility of seeking only worldly enjoyment. So, Arjuna's question, what is the difference between sannyasa and tyaga? The answer is a sannyasi is one who renounces conventional worldly enjoyments, and the tyagi is actually a karma yogi. That's one who renounces raga and dvesha, one who my guru had a nice language. One who renounces one's personal agenda. He liked this language. To renounce your personal agenda and follow dharma instead. To renounce. So there's renunciation involved. This is karma yoga. Karma yoga is impossible without this particular kind of renunciation. To renounce your personal agenda and to follow dharma for the sake of spiritual growth. Now, Sri Krishna brings in some other points of view. He says, Tyajam doshavadyeke, Tyajam doshavadyeke, karma prahurmanishinaha, karma prahurmanishinaha, yajnadanatapa karma, yajnadanatapa karma, natyajamati chapare, natyajamati chapare. So Sri Krishna here gives two other ways of looking at this division between sannyasa and tyaga. He says at the end of the first line, AK, some people Some people drop down a line. Some who? Manishinaha, some wise ones, some thinkers. Some wise ones, prahuhu, some wise ones say, some wise ones consider that karma doshavat tyajam. Karma, and in particular kamya karma for the sake of enjoyment, is tyajam. It is to be renounced under all circumstances. Why? Doshavat, it is defective. In what sense is karma defective? No amount of worldly effort will ever result in perfect peace and contentment. Think about it. Let me say that a second time. This is a statement of the fundamental futility of conventional worldly life. And that statement is, no amount of worldly effort will ever culminate in perfect peace and contentment. Doshavat. That's the defect of worldly life. Having recognized that defect of worldly life, then that can give you plenty of motivation to give it up. Who cares? By the way, those who actually do give up the world are driven not merely, this point needs to be made. If you think that everyone who becomes a sannyasi does so because of this strong recognition of the futility of worldly life, no doubt that recognition is present, I think, in every sannyasi. But something else is usually present, and that is someone who just isn't that attracted to conventional worldly life. If somebody recognizes the futility of worldly life, but they really enjoy movies. That strong enjoyment of movies means that person probably won't become a sannyasi and renounce worldly life. So it's a little bit more complex. Part of it is recognition of the futility of worldly life, coupled with, how about we call it a inclination, better yet, disinclination towards conventional worldly enjoyments. When those two are connected, disinclination towards conventional worldly enjoyments coupled with this recognition of the futility of worldly life, this leads to lifestyle sannyasa, which is what the first half of this verse is about. But now, the second half is another point of view. In fact, the last line, and the last word, Ch.18. Apare means others. Others say, iti, what do they say? They say, na tyajam. So the first group said, tyajam. Karma, tyajam. All karma is to be given up. Why? Doshavat. The second group says, no, karma na tyajam. All karmas are not to be given up because every single karma is not doshavat, defective. There are some karmas that are not defective. What kind of karmas? Third line, karmas like yajna, worship. Worship is not defective. Dana, charity. Charity is not defective. Tapas, spiritual austerities. These three were discussed extensively in a prior chapter. You remember? Yajna, Dana, and Tapas. They were discussed in chapter 17. And in particular, Sri Krishna said that when these three practices are done with a sattvika attitude, they lead to spiritual growth. Now remember that discussion about sattvika attitude? Remember tamasa attitude was to use it for untoward reasons, really guided by ignorance. Rajasa attitude was to do to do rituals and charity and tapas to kind of show off how great you are, how spiritual you are, how pious you are. But the sattvika attitude is to do rituals, charity, and spiritual austerities because you must do them for the sake of spiritual growth. So just it's part of your dharma as a spiritual seeker, it's part of your responsibility to do them. So with that sattvika attitude, definitely this kind of karma, what kind of karma? Acts of yajna, worship, acts of dana, acts of charity, and acts of tapas, spiritual austerity. These acts na tyajam, these are not to be given up. So here we're back to this same twofold division that Sri Krishna made. The first half of this verse is talking about people who promote lifestyle sannyasa, and the second half of this verse is about those who don't promote lifestyle sannyasa, but they say, fulfill your duty as a karma yogi who renounces not karma, as a karma yogi who renounces karma phala, seeking the limited results of your duties. Okay, then after giving these two other points of view, which are pretty similar to what Sri Krishna said, now Sri Krishna is going to come to his final point of view on this particular topic, where he says, Nishchayam shrunu me tatra, Nishchayam shrunu me tatra, Tyage bharata sattama, Tyage bharata sattama, Tyago hi purusha vyagra, Tyago hi purusha vyagro, Triveda samprakirtitaha, Triveda samprakirtitaha. O Arjuna, and that second line, Bharata Sattama, O best of India. O Arjuna, Shrinu, listen. Listen to what? Me nishchayam tatra. Listen tatra with regard to this. Listen to me nishchayam, my conclusion about tyage, about tyaga, about renunciation. O Arjuna, listen to my conclusion about tyaga, about renunciation. In the third line, he addresses Arjuna again as Purusha Vyagra, as a tiger among people, as a mighty person. He says, he indeed, tyagaha, renunciation, trivedaha, threefold, samprakirtitaha, is said to be. Tyaga is said to be threefold. I wonder what that threefold would be. Couldn't be sattva, rajas, tamas. You get my point. Okay, and that's going to come after several more verses. So that analysis has started way back in chapter 14, continued in chapters 16 and 17. It's going to come back here in just a couple more verses. But before Sri Krishna does that, he comes back to this prior topic about yajna, dana, and tapas, which he talked about back in chapter 17. So now he really wants to address, in fact, he's going to get a little critical of lifestyle sannyasa. He's going to criticize it because you're giving up doing rituals. You're giving up doing acts of charity. Acts of charity. When you renounce the world, what do you have to give to others? So there's a fairly complicated issue at play here, which Sri Krishna is going to address in the next verse. Yajna dana tapa karma, yajna dana tapa karma, natyajam karyam eva tata, natyajam karyam eva tata, yajño dhanam tapaschaiva, yajño dhanam tapaschaiva, bhavanani manishinam, bhavanani manishinam. So Sri Krishna comes back to these three important spiritual practices: worship, charity, and spiritual austerities like fasting. Sri Krishna says, yajna, dana, and tapa, these three kinds of karma, na tyajyam. Pretty clear. They should not be renounced, like they are renounced by those who take to lifestyle sannyasa. He says, in fact, karyameva tat. That karma must be done. Now, with these words, Sri Krishna is being quite critical of sannyasa as a lifestyle. That's what it is. But every teaching must be understood in context. Does Sri Krishna's legitimate criticism of lifestyle sannyasa, that legitimate criticism shouldn't be generalized into such a way that, no one should take sannyasa. That's not the point here. Every teaching has a context. What is the context here? Sri Krishna's teaching, Arjuna. Can Arjuna reject the world and go off and live as a sannyasi? Arjuna has a duty to fulfill on the battlefield. So the context here is Sri Krishna is teaching someone for whom sannyasa is not an option. There are many people for whom sannyasa are not an option. You might remember when we talked about chapter 5, sannyasa, I gave the but I explained that my guru, when his disciples would ask for initiation as sannyasis, my guru had two main requirements. First of all, the main requirement should not be that this person is a scholar of Vedanta. That was not a requirement. It was not a requirement that the disciple should be enlightened. These were not requirements. What were the two requirements? Basic requirement is it should be his own student. Second requirement, which is the key one here, he would ask every single person, including me, is anyone dependent on you financially or otherwise? That is, if you take sannyasa, are you running away from any responsibilities? This was his point in asking that question. Is anyone dependent on you? He would not give sannyasa to someone, for example, if someone was responsible to take care of elderly parents. He wouldn't give sannyasa. If there was any kind of dependence, he wouldn't give sannyasa. So, which means where there is a responsibility that would be dropped through the act of renunciation, taking lifestyle sannyasa, those situations would be inappropriate. That is what my guru rejected, and that is what Sri Krishna rejects here. Every teaching has a context. Several people have commented that when reading works of Shankaracharya, the greatest teacher in our Advaita Vedanta lineage, many people remark that Shankara seems to be saying that you won't get enlightened unless you're a sannyasi. If you look at his commentaries, he takes a pretty strong line on the importance of sannyasa, and when you read his works, it becomes pretty clear that Shankaracharya really felt that sannyasa was essential for the sake of enlightenment. again, go back to context. Shankara was a lifestyle sannyasi. His disciples were lifestyle sannyasis. When you have a sannyasi teaching sannyasis, what do you expect? And that shows, by the way, something unique about the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is not a sannyasi teaching sannyasis. The Bhagavad Gita is Sri Krishna teaching Arjuna, and Arjuna represents everyone. So the context of the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita are so important, which is one of the many reasons the Bhagavad Gita is the most widely studied spiritual text. And this is one of the reasons the context of the teachings is given to people. These are teachings meant for people engaged in normal worldly life. That's the idea. The Upanishads are a different story whatsoever, completely. In the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Yajnavalkya wants to divorce his wives. Bye. A little more complicated than that, but obviously that's a very different message, right? He says to his wives, Maitreyi, two of them, Maitreyi and Kaikeyi, bye. And that's it. So that's a very different message given by the rishis in the Upanishads, but how important is this message of the Bhagavad Gita given to people engaged in conventional life? Let's see, there's one more point which will fit in nicely here at the end. In the second half, Sri Krishna comes back to these three crucial spiritual practices: worship, yajna, charity, dana, and penance, spiritual austerity is tapas. He says these three, pavanani, pavana, purifying. They are purifying, manishinam, for the wise, when they are done with this sattvika attitude. They are purifying, meaning they lead you on a path of spiritual growth. They lead you towards perfect peace and contentment. They lead you towards enlightenment. The significance here is Sri Krishna is arguing against sannyasa. He's arguing here for conventional life, and for very good reason. He says, pavanani. To live a conventional life can be a very good spiritual practice. And that reminds me of something my guru liked to say. He was a sannyasi. In fact, from his, how old was he? He was about 30 years old when he took sannyasa. And he lived his whole long life then as a sannyasa. And he taught hundreds of us, of his disciples who became sannyasis, but most of his students were not sannyasis. And his message was always carefully tuned to whatever audience he was in front of. So when he's in front of a bunch of sannyasis, you can imagine he talks a little bit more like Shankaracharya, but when he's with a more general group of grihastas, householders, you'll be very surprised. I recall one very, he had a way of explaining that when people live together, the way he explained it is, we all have like rough edges, like rocks. Some of you know that if you put rocks in the machine that tumbles the rocks, they call it a tumbler. You put the rocks in this machine with some grinding agent, and the rocks are tumbled and tumbled. They become all soft, rounded, very soft, very nice, rounded rocks. And for my guru, it was a good metaphor. He says, at the beginning, we're all like these sharp rough-edged rocks. But when you put rocks together in a tumbler, and for him that metaphor means when you put husband, wife, and children together in a family, that tumbling takes place, and all the rough edges get rubbed off, get softened. He truly saw conventional worldly life as an important practice for emotional and spiritual growth. Many times he would give blessings before a wedding, and almost always his words of blessing were this: your marriage will contribute to your spiritual growth. Marriage is meant for the sake of spiritual growth. All of life is meant for the sake of spiritual growth when we have the proper attitude. So when he was with a newly married couple, he would try to get them to appreciate that perspective, that this marriage is not meant for enjoyment, it's not meant for progeny. This marriage is meant for spiritual growth. So what do you lose out on by not becoming a lifestyle sannyasa? In fact, as Sri Krishna argues here, and as my guru commented, that conventional life can be very advantageous for gaining spiritual growth. That's the point here. We'll see one more verse. Etan yapitu karmani, etan yapitu karmani, sangam tyaktva phalani cha, sangam tyaktva phalani cha, kartavyani ti me partha, kartavyani ti me partha, nishchitam matam uttamam, nishchitam matam uttamam. Etani tu karmani, tu in particular, etani api, these karmani, these acts, these three acts. What are the three karmas? Yajna, dana, and tapas. These three, and you have to drop down to the third line. These three are kartavyani. They are to be done. They are to be done how? And this is crucial. He says they are to be done with what attitude? Sattvika, Rajasa, or Tamasa? As we discussed before, with a sattvika attitude, that's what he says in the second line. These three spiritual practices are to be done. Second line, tyaktva. Having given up two things. Having given up sangam, having given up attachment, palanicha, and having given up being driven by the results. Remember, we gave that example in the last chapter for fasting. Somebody who wants to lose weight and look buff. That is being driven by the result. That's a Rajasa attitude. So Sri Krishna says that when these three spiritual practices are done, sangam tyaktva, when they're done without attachment, tyaktva palani, and without being driven to get the fruits of those actions, they lead to spiritual growth. And that means for a person engaged in conventional worldly life, marriage, family, everything, for that person who continues their spiritual practice while engaged in worldly life, they can reach enlightenment. They will be on a path of spiritual growth. And Sri Krishna concludes, Partha, O Arjuna, me matam. This is me, my matam, my conclusion, my nishchitam matam, my well-determined, my well-considered conclusion. Me uttamam matam, my highest conclusion. So Sri Krishna it's giving a little sales pitch here to Arjuna. So Arjuna is, remember back in chapter 2, Arjuna is a little conflicted. Do I really want to stay on this battlefield and kill all my family members? Wouldn't it be better to go off and live in a cave someplace? So Sri Krishna, one more time here, is encouraging Arjuna and all of us, encouraging us to stay engaged in worldly life, because engagement in worldly life leads to spiritual growth. Let me just make one closing comment here. I included myself in that comment. All of us should be engaged in worldly life. You know, I could live in a cave. What is that? I'll live in a cave made of wood and plaster. It's my room. It's over there. It's a cave made of wood and plaster. I can sit in that cave and very nicely live out the remainder of my life without teaching, without producing videos, without being engaged in the world in any way whatsoever. I could do that. But why? I can think of so many benefits, both for myself and for others, by being engaged in worldly activities. The mere withdrawal from worldly activities is not beneficial. Some of you remember my anecdote. Yeah, we'll end with this. I've told this story several times. This is 1986, my first visit to India. I'm up in the Himalayas, and I'm very anxious to meet this Mauni Baba, this guy who maintains silence. He's been living in a cave for 10 years. I couldn't wait. I was a typical young Westerner. I was wearing jeans and t-shirt in those days and climbing up the hill and really looking forward to see this Mauni Baba. And what I saw disappointed me so much. When I arrived, and some of you remember this, I have to demonstrate. This is what I saw. He is sitting outside his cave reading a newspaper. Do you see the irony? Why live in a cave and then bring the world with you into the cave in the form of that newspaper? Not only that, but as he's reading the newspaper, and you won't be able to see this on camera, so I'll have to say, his foot was doing this. You can't see on camera, my foot is doing this, and that's what this guy was doing. So he's reading the newspaper like this, and what struck me immediately, he lived in that cave for 10 years, practicing Maunam. What did he get out of it? I don't know, but on the surface, it looks like he didn't get much out of that. So let's be very clear that this kind of idealistic thinking about going off and living in a cave and just being a recluse and immersing yourself in deep meditation is an inferior approach to spiritual growth. Being engaged in life is a superior approach to spiritual growth. And that's exactly what Sri Krishna says here. Okay, we'll continue next week. Om Sarve Bhavan. Oh, excuse me. Sorry. I'm a little spacey today. We end this class with our brief arati at the altar. I'm sorry. and just not paying attention. You probably heard me chanting very nicely, making some mistakes when I'm not paying attention. Closing announcements, tomorrow, Sunday, we have our Vedanta class at 10 o'clock. Shankara's brilliant work, Upadesha Sahasrari, come join us. Immediately after that class at 11 is Satsanga, question answers. Please come join us. And we'll conclude with our brief prayers at the altar. Om Gananaham Tva Ganapatigam Avamahi Kaving Gavinam Upamashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspataha Nashranvan Utibhisira Saranam Om Mahaganapataye Namaha Ishvaro Gururatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Dakshina Murtaye Namaha Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramardanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadgurum Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschad Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityor ma amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.